In modern warfare, aviation is an essential part of any armed operation. Having control of the air makes it possible to support your own movements and disrupt or entirely hinder those of the enemy. In the 19th century, aviation was still in its infancy, and that meant that the height of innovation was the balloon. Some successes had been shown during the War of the First Coalition. General Jourdan had used balloon reconnaissance at the Battle of Fleurus in 1794, and it was trumpeted as a great success and being crucial to the French victory. During this time, the use of balloons in war was highly experimental and often very dangerous for the observer, as the flimsy and unpredictable constructions were prone to accidents. In this video, we're going to examine the use of balloons during the American Civil War and look closer at one particular event that deeply affected balloon aviation in the U.S. Army. Before the Civil War, there had only been limited experiments with balloons on the American continent. The efforts that were present were mainly related to entertainment. Some interesting and innovative ideas were floated by various people in regards to the potential military benefits that balloons could offer. During the Second Seminole War, some enthusiasts suggested using balloons with cavalry to locate the natives in the Florida swamps. In the Mexican War, a keen balloonist named John Wise suggested using balloons as bombers to destroy strategic locations. None of these ideas were accepted by the military. Despite the rejection of both these innovative proposals, members of the military definitely saw the potential of having eyes in the sky, especially if enemy positions could be pinpointed, movements could be detected, and artillery fire could be directed. When war broke out, there were efforts by both sides to develop observational balloons. The Union had 2 operational balloons by June 1861. These were due to the efforts of James Allen of the 1st Rhode Island. Unfortunately for Allen, one of the balloons ruptured upon being filled with gas, and the other went up briefly during weather that was not ideal and was subsequently impaled on a telegraph pole. His efforts were disbanded, and he was eventually transferred to the newly created Balloon Corps when it was established under Thaddeus Lowe. Lowe probably had more experience than anyone else did. During the early 1850s, he had been part of an effort to fly a balloon across the North Atlantic Sea. In 1859, he completed a massive balloon named City of New York that was about 9 times the size of regular spherical balloons. Sadly for Lowe, bad weather and problems with the supply of hydrogen gas caused delays, and his balloon eventually ruptured before he could attempt his ambitious voyage. At the outbreak of war, Lowe offered his services to the Union Army. He proposed a few designs, but his bids to construct balloons for the early campaigns were higher than those of his opponents. He eventually secured funds to build a large spherical balloon dubbed the Union that had its maiden flight over Arlington, Virginia. He was quickly subjected to Confederate artillery fire that proved ineffectual. During September, he ascended with his balloon regularly, conducting reconnaissance along the Potomac River, practiced moving Union to different locations, all without accident. Because no offensive operations were initiated, his efforts were mainly useful in improving the routine of Ascension. His most important contribution was his employment of a mobile hydrogen gas generator that he had designed. This meant that the balloons did not have to go back to the city when they needed refilling, but it could be done at the front. He also developed signals that could be executed from balloons to ground forces, employing flags and flares to signal movements. On September 24th, he entered the history books, being the first American to attempt to correct gunfire from a balloon. He worked with General W. F. Smith's guns to direct the fire at Confederate targets. Smith gave Lowe relatively easy instructions in regard to the correction of fire. If we fire to the right of Falls Church, let a white flag be raised in the balloon. If to the left, let it be lowered. If over, let it be stationary. If under, let it be waved occasionally. The effort seemed to work, and the next day, Smith led a patrol forward with artillery support, and Lowe flying above to offer direction to any supporting fire that might be needed. The patrol did not encounter any resistance, but it was another useful experience. After these repeated and reliable successes, Lowe received extra funding and was allowed to set up a balloon corps with 5 balloons to begin with. The type of fire direction that Lowe and Smith had attempted seemed to have most potential in sieges, as targets would be mostly stationary. It was during the siege of Yorktown that Lowe would have a real chance to show how beneficial balloon observation could be to the besieging Union Army. Lowe developed a working relationship with the Union commander of the 5th Corps, Fitz John Porter, and the Union Corps commander would often venture into the air with Lowe to observe Confederate movements and reconnoiter their positions. Porter gradually became comfortable with the balloon and learned to operate it without Lowe being present. Around 5 in the morning, on the 11th of April, 1862, Porter wanted to ascend in the balloon Intrepid and observe nearby Confederate movements. The Intrepid was a tethered balloon, meaning that it was secured to the ground with the aid of several long ropes that went from the balloon car to the ground. Normally, Lowe insisted on using 3 or 4 ropes as a safety precaution when any ascensions was to be executed. Crucially, he was absent that morning when Porter wanted to reconnoiter the enemy. With Lowe being absent, James Allen directed the necessary preparations for Porter's ascent. He reckoned that greater height and therefore better visibility could be achieved if only a single tether was used. His reasoning being that a single tether meant only a fraction of the weight. Unknown to Allen, acid had spilled from the hydrogen generator and onto the single tether that was going to be used in the ascent. The balloon was beginning to fill with gas when Porter got into the car, but as Allen was making final preparations before joining Porter, a loud noise was suddenly heard. The Union war correspondent, George Alfred Townsend, was there at the time. He described it in the following terms. Noisily, fitfully, the yellow mass rose into the sky, the basket rocking like a feather, and just as I turned aside to speak to a comrade, a sound came from overhead, like the explosion of a shell, and something striking me across the face laid me flat upon the ground. Half blind and stunned, I staggered to my feet, but the air seemed full of cries and curses. Opening my eyes ruefully, I saw all faces turned upwards, and when I looked above, the balloon was adrift. The treacherous cable, rotted with vitriol, had snapped in twain. One fragment had been the cause of my downfall, and the other trailed like a great entrails from the receding car, where Fitz John Porter was bounding upward upon a Pegasus that he could neither check nor direct. Porter was at this point drifting in the air without any connection to the ground, and although he had ascended with Lowe many times, he had not been in his current predicament before. Lowe himself had now also arrived in the Ascension area and realized quickly what had happened. Townsend described the situation further. The general appeared directly over the edge of the car. He was tossing his hands frightfully and shouting something that we could not comprehend. "Open the valve," called Lowe in his shrill tones. "Climb to the netting and reach the valve robe. The valve, the valve," repeated a multitude of tongues, and all gazed with thrilling interest at the retreating hulk that was still kept straight upward, swerving neither to east nor the west. It was a weird spectacle, that frail, fading oval gliding against the sky, floating in the serene azure, the little vessel swinging silently beneath, and 100,000 martial men watching the loss of their brother in arms, but powerless to relieve or recover him. The Intrepid gradually began to drift away from the Union lines and headed for the Confederate lines. Porter was surprisingly calm. He used the time to make small notes of the enemy position and was later able to draw out a surprising amount of detail. The incident had started to cause commotion, both among a growing number of Union spectators and among the Confederate soldiers who prepared to take action against the Union general who was lost in the air. Although Porter was directly above the Confederate lines, the height of the balloon was his first stroke of luck. The Confederate artillery could not be elevated high enough to fire, and although there were scattered shots from muskets, these eventually ceased as they appeared to have no effect. Eventually, Porter had another lucky break. The direction of the wind changed and he blew back towards the Union lines. Porter was still, apparently, unable to descend as he had not been in this situation before and was likely fearful that another change in the wind would blow him back towards the Confederates. As Porter was again over the Union lines, he was successful in reaching the valve that Lowe had instructed him to open earlier. The Intrepid began descending rapidly towards the ground, and Union cavalry and Porter's staff galloped towards the suspected landing area. Porter's landing was not exactly graceful. The general landed on a tent that was entirely smashed by the impact. Porter's staff reached the area and were able to greet him and ascertain that he had survived the ordeal entirely unharmed, if somewhat shaken. Although Porter had survived and also managed to draw some of the Confederate positions, he would not attempt any further balloon ascensions during the war. His incident in the balloon, although it had a happy ending, clouded the balloon corps with uncertainty. General McClellan, who was Porter's commanding officer, as well as one of his closest friends, summed up his view of the incident in a letter to his wife that he wrote the same day. "I am just recovering from a terrible scare. Early this morning I was awakened by a dispatch from Fitz John's headquarters, stating that Fitch had made an ascension in the balloon, and that the balloon had broken away and come to ground 3 miles southwest, which would be within the enemy's lines. You can imagine how I felt. I at once set off to the various pickets to find out what they knew, and tried to do something to save him. But the order had no sooner gone than in walks Mr. Fitch, just as cool as casual. He had luckily come down near my own camp, after actually passing over that of the enemy. You may rest assured of one thing, you won't catch me in the confounded balloon, nor will I allow any other generals to go up in it." McClellan did not immediately forbid generals to go up in Lowe's balloons. In fact, on the 4th of May, Lowe ascended in another balloon with General Samuel Heintzelman, and the two identified the fact that the Confederates were retreating. They forwarded the intelligence to McClellan, but he dismissed it. He instead chose to rely on what later proved to be the faulty intelligence provided by Alan Pinkerton. Porter's close escape from disaster proved to be a severe setback to the Union aerial reconnaissance and the ambitions of Professor Lowe, something he realized himself. He summed it up in the following way: "I found it difficult to restore confidence among the officers as to the safety of this means of observation on account of this accident." Thank you for watching this video on interesting events from the Civil War. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and comment. If you don't want to miss any future videos on similar topics, we hope you'll consider subscribing to our channel. See you next time.